The murderer of Michael III in 867 AD was Basil, called the Macedonian. The new emperor proved himself a brave military leader, heading the empire's forces against the encroachments of the Saracens and bringing much-needed order and justice to the empire's ramshackle social order. Says Gibbon, "In the character of a judge, he was assiduous and impartial, desirous to save but not afraid to strike. The oppressors of the people were severely chastised, but his personal foes, whom it might be unsafe to pardon, were condemned, after the loss of their eyes, to a life of solitude and repentance." Basil had 4 sons. Constantine died before his father. Stephen, the youngest, took on the role of a patriarch. Leo and Alexander were both invested with the purple, but government was solely exercised by Leo, who became Leo VI.
The name of Leo VI has been dignified with the title of philosopher, and the union of the prince and the sage, of the active and speculative virtues, would indeed constitute the perfection of human nature. But the claims of Leo are far short of this ideal excellence. The reputation of his philosophy and religion was overthrown by a domestic vice, the repetition of his nuptials. The primitive ideas of the merit and holiness of celibacy were preached by the monks and entertained by the Greeks. Marriage was allowed as a necessary means for the propagation of mankind. After the death of either party, the survivor might satisfy by a second union the weakness or the strength of the flesh. But a third marriage was censured as a state of legal fornication, and a fourth was a sin or scandal as yet unknown to the Christians of the East. In the beginning of his reign, Leo himself had abolished the state of concubines and condemned, without annulling, third marriages. But his patriotism and love soon compelled him to violate his own laws and to incur the penance which, in a similar case, he had imposed on his subjects. In his 3 first alliances, his nuptial bed was unfruitful. The emperor required a female companion, and the empire a legitimate heir. The beautiful Zoe was introduced into the palace as a concubine, and after a trial of her fecundity and the birth of Constantine, her lover declared his intention of legitimating the mother and the child by the celebration of his 4th nuptials. But the patriarch Nicholas refused his blessing. The imperial baptism of the young prince was obtained by a promise of separation, and the contumacious husband of Zoe was excluded from the communion of the faithful. Neither the fear of exile, nor the desertion of his brethren, nor the authority of the Latin Church, nor the danger of failure or doubt in the succession to the empire could bend the spirit of the inflexible monk. After the death of Leo, Nicholas was recalled from exile to the civil and ecclesiastical administration, and the Edict of Union, which was promulgated in the name of Constantine, condemned the future scandal of 4th marriages, and left a tacit imputation on his own birth. The succeeding years of the minority of Constantine were occupied by his mother Zoe, and a succession or council of 7 regents who pursued their interest, gratified their passions, abandoned the republic, supplanted each other, and finally vanished in the presence of a soldier. The death of Constantine was imputed to poison, and his son Romanus, who derived that name from his maternal grandfather, ascended the throne of Constantinople. A prince who, at the age of 20, could be suspected of anticipating his inheritance must have been already lost in the public esteem. Yet Romanus was rather weak than wicked, and the largest share of the guilt was transferred to his wife, Theophano, a woman of base origin, masculine spirit, and flagitious manners. The sense of personal glory and public happiness, the true pleasures of royalty, were unknown to the son of Constantine, and while the 2 brothers, Nicephorus and Leo, triumphed over the Saracens, the hours which the emperor owed to his people were consumed in strenuous idleness. In the morning he visited the circus. At noon he feasted the senators. The greater part of the afternoon he spent in the Spheristerium, or tennis court, the only theatre of his victories. From thence he passed over to the Asiatic side of the Bosphorus, hunted and killed 4 wild boars of the largest size, and returned to the palace, proudly content with the labours of the day. In strength and beauty he was conspicuous above his equals. Tall and straight as a young cypress, his complexion was fair and florid, his eyes sparkling, his shoulders broad, his nose long and aquiline. Yet even these perfections were insufficient to fix the love of Theophano, and after a reign of 4 years she mingled for her husband the same deadly draught which she had composed for his father.
Having poisoned her husband, Theophano then took to her bed a soldier, Nicephorus Phocas, though the church refused to sanctify their marriage. Nicephorus reigned 6 years, only to be murdered in 976 AD by one of Theophano's many lovers, John Zimisces, who became emperor in turn. Having acceded to the throne, Zimisces dismissed Theophano.
In their last interview, she displayed a frantic and impotent rage, accused the ingratitude of her lover, assaulted with words and blows her son Basil, as he stood silent and submissive in the presence of a superior colleague, and avowed her own prostitution in proclaiming the illegitimacy of his birth. The public indignation was appeased by her exile and the punishment of the meaner accomplices. The death of an unpopular prince was forgiven, and the guilt of Zimisces was forgotten in the splendour of his virtues. Perhaps his profusion was less useful to the state than the avarice of Nicephorus, but his gentle and generous behaviour delighted all who approached his person, and it was only in the paths of victory that he trod in the footsteps of his predecessor. The greatest part of his reign was employed in the camp and the field. His personal valour and activity was signalized on the Danube and the Tigris, the ancient boundaries of the Roman world. And by his double triumph over the Russians and the Saracens, he deserved the titles of Saviour of the Empire and Conqueror of the East. In his last return from Syria, he observed that the most fruitful lands of his new provinces were possessed by the eunuchs. "And is it for them," he exclaimed with honest indignation, "that we have fought and conquered? Is it for them that we shed our blood and exhaust the treasures of our people?" The complaint was re-echoed to the palace, and the death of Zimisces is strongly marked with the suspicion of poison.
The death of John Zimisces meant the return to the throne of Basil and Constantine, the 2 lawful emperors, sons of Romanus. Gibbon marches swiftly across Basil's reign, who died en route in a holy war against the Saracens in Sicily. His brother Constantine then came to power, but survived for only 3 further years. Says Gibbon, "He had enjoyed 66 years the title of Augustus, and the reign of the 2 brothers is the longest and most obscure of the Byzantine history." The death of Constantine IX ushered in a rapid succession of emperors, with, says Gibbon, the accumulated years of 12 emperors not equal to the space of his single reign. Gibbon swiftly dispenses with 28 years in the empire's history, moving on to discuss a period that he clearly finds fascinating, that of the rise and dominance of the Comnenian dynasty, who were to provide the emperors stretching from Isaac I in 1059 AD to Andronicus I, who died in 1185 AD. The brother of Isaac I, John, refused the purple when Isaac was in decline. Instead, it was accepted by Constantine Ducas, Constantine XI, a friend of the Comnenian family. Says Gibbon, "If Constantine XI were indeed the subject most worthy of empire, we must pity the debasement of the age and nation in which he was chosen." Following internecine struggles between the descendants of Constantine XI and those of John Comnenus, Alexius, the 3rd and most illustrious of the male offspring of John Comnenus, became emperor in 1078 AD.
In a long reign of 37 years, he subdued and pardoned the envy of his equals. The laws of public and private order were restored. The arts of wealth and science were cultivated. The limits of the empire were enlarged in Europe and Asia, and the Comnenian sceptre was transmitted to his children of the 3rd and 4th generation. Yet the difficulties of the times betrayed some defects in his character, and have exposed his memory to some just or ungenerous reproach. The increase of the male and female branches of his family adorned the throne and secured the succession, but their princely luxury and pride offended the patricians, exhausted the revenue, and insulted the misery of the people. His happiness was destroyed and his health was broken by the cares of a public life. The patience of Constantinople was fatigued by the length and severity of his reign, and before Alexius expired, he had lost the love and reverence of his subjects. The clergy could not forgive his application of the sacred riches to the defence of the state, but they applauded his theological learning and ardent zeal for the orthodox faith, which he defended with his tongue, his pen, and his sword. His character was degraded by the superstition of the Greeks, and the same inconsistent principle of human nature enjoined the emperor to found a hospital for the poor and infirm, and to direct the execution of a heretic who was burnt alive in the square of St. Sophia. Even the sincerity of his moral and religious virtues was suspected by the persons who had passed their lives in his familiar confidence. In his last hours, when he was pressed by his wife Irene to alter the succession, he raised his head and breathed a pious ejaculation on the vanity of this world. The indignant reply of the empress may be inscribed as an epitaph on his tomb: "You die as you have lived, a hypocrite." The two sons of Alexius, John and Isaac, maintained the fraternal concord, the hereditary virtue of their race, and the younger brother was content with the title of Sebastocrata, which approached the dignity without sharing the power of the emperor. In the same person, the claims of primogeniture and merit were fortunately united. His swarthy complexion, harsh features, and diminutive stature had suggested the ironical surname of Carlo Johannes, or John the Handsome, which his grateful subjects more seriously applied to the beauties of his mind. His reign was never disturbed by conspiracy or rebellion. Feared by his nobles, beloved by his people, John was never reduced to the painful necessity of punishing or even of pardoning his personal enemies. During his government of 25 years, the penalty of death was abolished in the Roman Empire, a law of mercy most delightful to the humane theorist, but of which the practice in a large and vicious community is seldom consistent with a public safety. Severe to himself, indulgent to others, chaste, frugal, abstemious, the philosophic Marcus would not have disdained the artless virtues of his successor, derived from his heart and not borrowed from the schools. He despised and moderated the stately magnificence of the Byzantine court, so oppressive to the people, so contemptible to the eye of reason. Under such a prince, innocence had nothing to fear, and merit had everything to hope. And without assuming the tyrannic office of a censor, he introduced a gradual though visible reformation in the public and private manners of Constantinople. The only defect of this accomplished character was the frailty of noble minds, the love of arms and military glory. Yet the frequent expeditions of John the Handsome may be justified, at least in their principle, by the necessity of repelling the Turks from the Hellespont and the Bosphorus. He hunted the wild boar in the valley of Anazarbus, and had fixed his javelin in the body of the furious animal. But in the struggle a poisoned arrow dropped from his quiver, and a slight wound in his hand, which produced a mortification, was fatal to the best and greatest of the Comnenian princes.
Following John II, his son Manuel I reigned for 37 years. Years that were, as Gibbon says, filled by a perpetual though various warfare against the Turks, the Christians, and the hordes of the wilderness beyond the Danube. And the Byzantine monarchy for a while became an object of respect or terror to the powers of Asia and Europe.
Manuel possessed the iron temper of a soldier, which cannot easily be paralleled, except in the lives of Richard I of England and of Charles XII of Sweden. Such was his strength and exercise in arms that Raymond, surnamed the Hercules of Antioch, was incapable of wielding the lance and buckler of the Greek emperor. In a famous tournament, he entered the lists on a fiery courser and overturned in his first career 2 of the stoutest of the Italian knights. The first in the charge, the last in the retreat, his friends and his enemies alike trembled, the former for his safety and the latter for their own. After posting an ambuscade in a wood, he rode forwards in search of some perilous adventure, accompanied only by his brother and the faithful Axuch, who refused to desert their sovereign. 18 horsemen, after a short combat, fled before them, but the numbers of the enemy increased. The march of the reinforcement was tardy and fearful, and Manuel, without receiving a wound, cut his way through a squadron of 500 Turks. In one day he is said to have slain above 40 of the barbarians with his own hand. He returned to the camp, dragging along 4 Turkish prisoners, whom he had tied to the rings of his saddle. He was ever the foremost to provoke or to accept a single combat, and the gigantic champions who encountered his arm were transpierced by the lance or cut asunder by the sword of the invincible Manuel. The story of his exploits, which appear as a model or a copy of the romances of chivalry, may induce a reasonable suspicion of the veracity of the Greeks. I will not, to vindicate their credit, endanger my own. Yet I may observe that, in the long series of their annals, Manuel is the only prince who has been the subject of similar exaggeration. But the most singular feature in the character of Manuel is the contrast and vicissitude of labour and sloth, of hardiness and effeminacy. In war he seemed ignorant of peace. In peace he appeared incapable of war. In the field he slept in the sun or in the snow, tired in the longest marches the strength of his men and horses, and shared with a smile the abstinence or diet of the camp. No sooner did he return to Constantinople than he resigned himself to the arts and pleasures of a life of luxury. The expense of his dress, his table, and his palace surpassed the measure of his predecessors, and whole summer days were idly wasted in the delicious isles of the Propontis, in the incestuous love of his niece Theodora. The double cost of a warlike and dissolute prince exhausted the revenue and multiplied the taxes, and Manuel, in the distress of his last Turkish camp, endured a bitter reproach from the mouth of a desperate soldier. As he quenched his thirst, he complained that the water of a fountain was mingled with Christian blood. "It is not the first time," exclaimed a voice from the crowd, "that you have drunk, O Emperor, the blood of your Christian subjects." Manuel Comnenus was twice married, to the virtuous Bertha or Irene of Germany, and to the beauteous Maria, a French or Latin princess of Antioch. The only daughter of his first wife was destined for Bela, an Hungarian prince, who was educated at Constantinople under the name of Alexius, and the consummation of their nuptials might have transferred the Roman sceptre to a race of free and warlike barbarians. But as soon as Maria of Antioch had given a son and heir to the empire, the presumptive rights of Bela were abolished, and he was deprived of his promised bride. But the Hungarian prince resumed his name and the kingdom of his fathers, and displayed such virtues as might excite the regret and envy of the Greeks. The son of Maria was named Alexius, and at the age of 10 years he ascended the Byzantine throne, after his father's decease had closed the glories of the Comnenian line.
Following the death of Manuel I, the colourful figure of Andronicus, son of Isaac, who was in turn the son of Alexius I, came to the fore, claiming to be the guardian of Manuel I's heir, Alexius III, who was but a boy of 12 or 14 years of age. Andronicus returned from the provinces to put down a civil war in Constantinople, one led by the Italian husband of Alexius's sister Mary against her stepmother, also named Mary.
It was the first care of Andronicus to occupy the palace, to salute the emperor, to confine his mother, to punish her minister, and to restore the public order and tranquillity. In the first months of his administration, his designs were veiled by a fair semblance of hypocrisy, which could delude only the eyes of the multitude. The coronation of Alexius was performed with due solemnity, and his perfidious guardian, holding in his hands the body and blood of Christ, most fervently declared that he lived and was ready to die for the service of his beloved pupil. But his numerous adherents were instructed to maintain that the sinking empire must perish in the hands of a child, that the Romans could only be saved by a veteran prince, bold in arms, skilful in policy, and taught to reign by the long experience of fortune and mankind, and that it was the duty of every citizen to force the reluctant modesty of Andronicus to undertake the burden of the public care. The young emperor was himself constrained to join his voice to the general acclamation, and to solicit the association of a colleague who instantly degraded him from the supreme rank, secluded his person, and verified the rash declaration of the patriarch that Alexius might be considered as dead so soon as he was committed to the custody of his guardian. But his death was preceded by the imprisonment and execution of his mother. After blackening her reputation and inflaming against her the passions of the multitude, the tyrant accused and tried the empress for a treasonable correspondence with the King of Hungary. His own son, a youth of honour and humanity, avowed his abhorrence of this flagitious act, and 3 of the judges had the merit of preferring their conscience to their safety. But the obsequious tribunal, without requiring any proof or hearing any defence, condemned the widow of Manuel, and her unfortunate son subscribed the sentence of her death. Maria was strangled, her corpse was buried in the sea, and her memory was wounded by the insult most offensive to female vanity, a false and ugly representation of her beauteous form. The fate of her son was not long deferred. He was strangled with a bowstring, and the tyrant, insensible to pity or remorse, after surveying the body of the innocent youth, struck it rudely with his foot. "Thy father," he cried, "was a knave, thy mother a whore, and thyself a fool." The Roman sceptre, the reward of his crimes, was held by Andronicus about 3 years and a half as the guardian or sovereign of the empire. His government exhibited a singular contrast of vice and virtue. When he listened to his passions, he was the scourge; when he consulted his reason, the father of his people. In the exercise of private justice he was equitable and rigorous. A shameful and pernicious venality was abolished, and the offices were filled with the most deserving candidates by a prince who had sense to choose and severity to punish. He prohibited the inhuman practice of pillaging the goods and persons of shipwrecked mariners. The provinces, so long the objects of oppression or neglect, revived in prosperity and plenty, and millions applauded the distant blessings of his reign, while he was cursed by the witnesses of his daily cruelties. The necessary extinction of the young emperor and his mother imposed the fatal obligation of extirpating the friends who hated and might punish the assassin, and the repetition of murder rendered him less willing and less able to forgive. A horrid narrative of the victims whom he sacrificed by poison or the sword, by the sea or the flames, would be less expressive of his cruelty than the appellation of the halcyon days, which was applied to a rare and bloodless week of repose. The tyrant strove to transfer on the laws and the judges some portion of his guilt, but the mask was fallen, and his subjects could no longer mistake the true author of their calamities. The noblest of the Greeks, more especially those who, by descent or alliance, might dispute the Comnenian inheritance, escaped from the monster's den. Nicaea or Prusa, Sicily or Cyprus were their places of refuge, and as their flight was already criminal, they aggravated their offence by an open revolt and the imperial title. Yet Andronicus resisted the daggers and swords of his most formidable enemies. Nicaea and Prusa were reduced and chastised. The Sicilians were content with the sack of Thessalonica, and the distance of Cyprus was not more propitious to the rebel than to the tyrant. His throne was subverted by a rival without a merit, and a people without arms. Isaac Angelus, a descendant in the Theban line from the great Alexius, was marked as a victim by the prudence or superstition of the emperor. In a moment of despair, Angelus defended his life and liberty, slew the executioner, and fled to the church of St. Sophia. The sanctuary was insensibly filled with a curious and mournful crowd, who, in his fate, prognosticated their own. But their lamentations were soon turned to curses, and their curses to threats. They dared to ask, "Why do we fear? Why do we obey? We are many, and he is one. Our patience is the only bond of our slavery." With the dawn of day, the city burst into a general sedition. The prisons were thrown open. The coldest and most servile were roused to the defense of their country. And Isaac, the second of the name, was raised from the sanctuary to the throne. Unconscious of his danger, the tyrant was absent, withdrawn from the toils of state in the delicious islands of the Propontis. He had contracted an indecent marriage with Alice, or Agnes, daughter of Louis VII of France, and relict of the unfortunate Alexius. And his society, more suitable to his temper than to his age, was composed of a young wife and a favourite concubine. On the first alarm he rushed to Constantinople, impatient for the blood of the guilty. But he was astonished by the silence of the palace, the tumult of the city, and the general desertion of mankind. Andronicus proclaimed a free pardon to his subjects. They neither desired nor would grant forgiveness. He offered to resign the crown to his son Manuel, but the virtues of the son could not expiate his father's crimes. The sea was still open for his retreat, but the news of the revolution had flown along the coast. When fear had ceased, obedience was no more. The imperial galley was pursued and taken by an armed brigantine, and the tyrant was dragged to the presence of Isaac Angelus, loaded with fetters and a long chain around his neck. His eloquence and the tears of his female companions pleaded in vain for his life. But instead of the decencies of a legal execution, the new monarch abandoned the criminal to the numerous sufferers whom he had deprived of a father, a husband, or a friend. His teeth and hair, an eye and a hand, were torn from him as a poor compensation for their loss, and a short respite was allowed that he might feel the bitterness of death. Astride on a camel, without any danger of a rescue, he was carried through the city, and the basest of the populace rejoiced to trample on the fallen majesty of their prince. After 1,000 blows and outrages, Andronicus was hung by the feet between two pillars that supported the statues of a wolf and a sow, and every hand that could reach the public enemy inflicted on his body some mark of ingenious or brutal cruelty, till two friendly or furious Italians, plunging their swords into his body, released him from all human punishment. In this long and painful agony, "Lord, have mercy upon me," and "Why will you bruise a broken reed?" were the only words that escaped from his mouth. Our hatred for the tyrant is lost in pity for the man, nor can we blame his pusillanimous resignation, since a Greek Christian was no longer master of his life. I have been tempted to expatiate on the extraordinary character and adventures of Andronicus, but I shall here terminate the series of the Greek emperors since the time of Heraclius. The branches that sprang from the Comnenian trunk had insensibly withered, and the male line was continued only in the posterity of Andronicus himself, who, in the public confusion, usurped the sovereignty of Trebizond, so obscure in history and so famous in romance. A private citizen of Philadelphia, Constantine Angelus, had emerged to wealth and honours by his marriage with the daughter of the Emperor Alexius. His son Andronicus is conspicuous only by his cowardice. His grandson Isaac punished and succeeded the tyrant. But he was dethroned by his own vices and the ambition of his brother, and their discord introduced the Latins to the conquest of Constantinople, the first great period in the fall of the Eastern Empire. If we compute the number and duration of the reigns, it will be found that a period of 600 years is filled by 60 emperors, including in the Augustan list some female sovereigns, and deducting some usurpers who were never acknowledged in the capital, and some princes who did not live to possess their inheritance. The average proportion will allow 10 years for each emperor, far below the chronological rule of Sir Isaac Newton, who, from the experience of more recent and regular monarchies, has defined about 18 or 20 years as the term of an ordinary reign. The Byzantine Empire was most tranquil and prosperous when it could acquiesce in hereditary succession. 5 dynasties, the Heraclean, Isaurian, Amorian, Basilian, and Comnenian families, enjoyed and transmitted the royal patrimony during their respective series of 5, 4, 3, 6, and 4 generations. Several princes number the years of their reign with those of their infancy, and Constantine VII and his 2 grandsons occupy the space of an entire century. But in the intervals of the Byzantine dynasties, the succession is rapid and broken, and the name of a successful candidate is speedily erased by a more fortunate competitor. Many were the paths that led to the summit of royalty. The fabric of rebellion was overthrown by the stroke of conspiracy, or undermined by the silent arts of intrigue. The favourites of the soldiers or people, or the senate or clergy, of the women and eunuchs, were alternately clothed with the purple. The means of their elevation were base, and their end was often contemptible or tragic. A being of the nature of man, endowed with the same faculties, but with a longer measure of existence, would cast down a smile of pity and contempt on the crimes and follies of human ambition, so eager in a narrow span to grasp at a precarious and short-lived enjoyment. It is thus that the experience of history exalts and enlarges the horizon of our intellectual view. In a composition of some days, in a perusal of some hours, 600 years have rolled away, and the duration of a life or reign is contracted to a fleeting moment. The grave is ever beside the throne. The success of a criminal is almost instantly followed by the loss of his prize, and our immortal reason survives and disdains the 60 phantoms of kings who have passed before our eyes and faintly dwell on our remembrance. The observation that in every age and climate ambition has prevailed with the same commanding energy may abate the surprise of a philosopher. But while he condemns the vanity, he may search the motive of this universal desire to obtain and hold the sceptre of dominion. To the greater part of the Byzantine series, we cannot reasonably ascribe the love of fame and of mankind. The virtue alone of John Comnenus was beneficent and pure. The most illustrious of the princes who precede or follow that respectable name have trod with some dexterity and vigour the crooked and bloody paths of a selfish policy. In scrutinizing the imperfect characters of Leo the Isaurian, Basil I, and Alexius Comnenus, of Theophilus, the second Basil, and Manuel Comnenus, our esteem and censure are almost equally balanced, and the remainder of the imperial crowd could only desire and expect to be forgotten by posterity. Was personal happiness the aim and object of their ambition? I shall not descant on the vulgar topics of the misery of kings, but I may surely observe that their condition of all others is the most pregnant with fear and the least susceptible of hope. For these opposite passions a larger scope was allowed in the revolutions of antiquity than in the smooth and solid temper of the modern world, which cannot easily repeat either the triumph of Alexander or the fall of Darius. But the peculiar infelicity of the Byzantine princes exposed them to domestic perils without affording any lively promise of foreign conquest. From the pinnacle of greatness, Andronicus was precipitated by a death more cruel and shameful than that of the vilest malefactor. But the most glorious of his predecessors had much more to dread from their subjects than to hope from their enemies. The army was licentious without spirit, the nation turbulent without freedom. The barbarians of the east and west pressed on the monarchy, and the loss of the provinces was terminated by the final servitude of the capital. The entire series of Roman emperors, from the first of the Caesars to the last of the Constantines, extends above 1,500 years, and the term of dominion, unbroken by foreign conquest, surpasses the measure of the ancient monarchies, the Assyrians or Medes, the successors of Cyrus, or those of Alexander.
The rise of Islam was to prove one of the fatal factors in the ultimate collapse of the Byzantine Empire, paralleling the deleterious impact of the barbarian hordes upon the Roman Empire in the West. In about 668 AD, the disciples of Muhammad laid siege to Constantinople for several years, though these so-called Saracens were beaten back, repeatedly repulsed over 6 summers. A second siege took place in 716 AD, this time much shorter-lived. After just 13 months, the Saracens again retreated. But the march of the Saracens was unstoppable. From Arabia into Africa, thence to Spain, and from there into France, where they reached the very banks of the Loire, beaten back solely by the efforts of the Franks under Charles Martel the Hammer. By 827 AD, the Saracens were at the gates of Rome, plundering the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul in the suburb of the Vatican. By the time Gibbon enters upon his 6th and final volume of this vast survey, he has reached the end of the 10th century, and the Crusades beckon. Jerusalem became the focus of the conflict between Islam and Christianity. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land had been stimulated by the conquest of Jerusalem by the Arabs. The tomb of Christ and a section of Jerusalem were in the hands of Christians, who were allowed to live and worship peacefully by their Arab rulers. But an obscure hermit from France, Peter, made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and on his return agitated for military action against the Saracen occupiers of the Holy Lands. Pope Urban II received this hermit as a prophet and undertook to lead the conquest of the Holy Lands. Urban spoke at the Synod of Placentia in 1095 AD, invoking the Holy Spirit on behalf of a crusade to animate the devotion and courage of the champions of Christ. Said Urban, "His cross is the symbol of your salvation. Wear it, a red, bloody cross, as an eternal mark, on your breasts or shoulders, as a pledge of your sacred and irrevocable engagement." Thus did the First Crusade begin. But the masterly historian always sets the scene within the crucial broader picture, and Gibbon's digression into the thorny subject of religious indulgences provides a vital sidelight onto the emotionally charged issue of recapturing the Holy Lands for Christianity.
So familiar, and as it were so natural to man, is the practice of violence, that our indulgence allows the slightest provocation, the most disputable right, as a sufficient ground of national hostility. But the name and nature of a holy war demands a more rigorous scrutiny. Nor can we hastily believe that the servants of the Prince of Peace would unsheath the sword of destruction unless the motive were pure, the quarrel legitimate, and the necessity inevitable. The policy of an action may be determined from the tardy lessons of experience. But before we act, our conscience should be satisfied of the justice and propriety of our enterprise. In the age of the Crusades, the Christians, both of the East and West, were persuaded of their lawfulness and merit. Their arguments are clouded by the perpetual abuse of scripture and rhetoric, but they seem to insist on the right of natural and religious defense, their peculiar title to the Holy Land, and the impiety of their pagan and Mohammedan foes. 1. The right of a just defense may fairly include our civil and spiritual allies. It depends on the existence of danger, and that danger must be estimated by the twofold consideration of the malice and the power of our enemies. A pernicious tenet has been imputed to the Mohammedans, the duty of extirpating all other religions by the sword. This charge of ignorance and bigotry is refuted by the Quran, by the history of the Mussulman conquerors, and by their public and legal toleration of the Christian worship. But it cannot be denied that the Oriental churches are depressed under their iron yoke, that in peace and war they assert a divine and indefeasible claim of universal empire, and that in their orthodox creed the unbelieving nations are continually threatened with a loss of religion or liberty. In the 11th century, the victorious arms of the Turks presented a real and urgent apprehension of these losses. They had subdued in less than 30 years the kingdoms of Asia as far as Jerusalem and the Hellespont, and the Greek Empire tottered on the verge of destruction. Besides an honest sympathy for their brethren, the Latins had a right and interest in the support of Constantinople, the most important barrier of the West, and the privilege of defence must reach to prevent as well as to repel an impending assault. But this salutary purpose might have been accomplished by a moderate succour, and our calmer reason must disclaim the innumerable hosts and remote operations which overwhelmed Asia and depopulated Europe. 2. Palestine could add nothing to the strength or safety of the Latins, and fanaticism alone could pretend to justify the conquest of that distant and narrow province. The Christians affirmed that their inalienable title to the Promised Land had been sealed by the blood of their divine Saviour. It was their right and duty to rescue their inheritance from the unjust possessors who profaned his sepulchre and oppressed the pilgrimage of his disciples. Vainly would it be alleged that the preeminence of Jerusalem and the sanctity of Palestine have been abolished with the Mosaic law, that the God of the Christians is not a local deity, and that the recovery of Bethlehem or Calvary, his cradle or his tomb, will not atone for the violation of the moral precepts of the gospel. Such arguments glance aside from the leaden shield of superstition, and the religious mind will not easily relinquish its hold on the sacred ground of mystery and miracle. 3. But the holy wars which have been waged in every climate of the globe, from Egypt to Livonia and from Peru to Hindustan, require the support of some more general and flexible tenet. It has been often supposed, and sometimes affirmed, that a difference of religion is a worthy cause of hostility, that obstinate unbelievers may be slain or subdued by the champions of the cross, and that grace is the sole fountain of dominion as well as of mercy. Above 400 years before the First Crusade, the eastern and western provinces of the Roman Empire had been acquired about the same time and in the same manner by the barbarians of Germany and Arabia. Time and treaties had legitimated the conquests of the Christian Franks. But in the eyes of their subjects and neighbours, the Mohammedan princes were still tyrants and usurpers who, by the arms of war or rebellion, might be lawfully driven from their unlawful possession. As the manners of the Christians were relaxed, their discipline of penance was enforced, and with the multiplication of sins, the remedies were multiplied. In the primitive church, a voluntary and open confession prepared the work of atonement. In the Middle Ages, the bishops and priests interrogated the criminal, compelled him to account for his thoughts, words, and actions, and prescribed the terms of his reconciliation with God. But as this discretionary power might alternately be abused by indulgence and tyranny, a rule of discipline was framed to inform and regulate the spiritual judges. This mode of legislation was invented by the Greeks. Their penitentials were translated or imitated in the Latin Church. And in the time of Charlemagne, the clergy of every diocese were provided with a code which they prudently concealed from the knowledge of the vulgar. In this dangerous estimate of crimes and punishments, each case was supposed, each difference was remarked, by the experience or penetration of the monks. Some sins are enumerated which innocence could not have suspected, and others which reason cannot believe. And the more ordinary offences of fornication and adultery, of perjury and sacrilege, of rapine and murder, were expiated by a penance which, according to the various circumstances, was prolonged from 40 days to 7 years. During this term of mortification, the patient was healed, the criminal was absolved by a salutary regimen of fasts and prayers. The disorder of his dress was expressive of grief and remorse, and he humbly abstained from all the business and pleasure of social life. But the rigid execution of these laws would have depopulated the palace, the camp, and the city. The barbarians of the West believed and trembled, but nature often rebelled against principle, and the magistrate laboured without effect to enforce the jurisdiction of the priest. A literal accomplishment of penance was indeed impracticable. The guilt of adultery was multiplied by daily repetition. That of homicide might involve the massacre of a whole people. Each act was separately numbered, and in those times of anarchy and vice, a modest sinner might easily incur a debt of 300 years. His insolvency was relieved by a commutation or indulgence. A year of penance was appreciated at 26 solidi of silver, about £4 sterling, for the rich, at 3 solidi or 9 shillings for the indigent. And these alms were soon appropriated to the use of the Church, which derived from the redemption of sins an inexhaustible source of opulence and dominion. A debt of 300 years, or £1,200, was enough to impoverish a plentiful fortune. The scarcity of gold and silver was supplied by the alienation of land, and the princely donations of Pepin and Charlemagne are expressly given for the remedy of their soul. It is a maxim of the civil law that whosoever cannot pay with his purse must pay with his body, and the practice of flagellation was adopted by the monks, a cheap though painful equivalent. By a fantastic arithmetic, a year of penance was taxed at 3,000 lashes, and such was the skill and patience of a famous hermit, Saint Dominic of the Iron Cuirass, that in 6 days he could discharge an entire century by a whipping of 300,000 stripes. His example was followed by many penitents of both sexes, and as a vicarious sacrifice was accepted, a sturdy disciplinarian might expiate on his own back the sins of his benefactors. These compensations of the purse and the person introduced in the 11th century a more honourable mode of satisfaction. The merit of military service against the Saracens of Africa and Spain had been allowed by the predecessors of Urban II. In the Council of Clermont, that Pope proclaimed a plenary indulgence to those who should enlist under the banner of the cross, the absolution of all their sins, and a full receipt for all that might be due of canonical penance. The cold philosophy of modern times is incapable of feeling the impression that was made on a sinful and fanatic world. At the voice of their pastor, the robber, the incendiary, the homicide arose by thousands to redeem their souls by repeating on the infidels the same deeds which they had exercised against their Christian brethren. And the terms of atonement were eagerly embraced by offenders of every rank and denomination. None were pure. None were exempt from the guilt and penalty of sin, and those who were the least amenable to the justice of God and the Church were the best entitled to the temporal and eternal recompense of their pious courage. If they fell, the spirit of the Latin clergy did not hesitate to adorn their tomb with a crown of martyrdom, and should they survive, they could expect, without impatience, the delay and increase of their heavenly reward. They offered their blood to the Son of God, who had laid down his life for their salvation. They took up the cross and entered with confidence into the way of the Lord. His providence would watch over their safety. Perhaps his visible and miraculous power would smooth the difficulties of their holy enterprise. The cloud and pillar of Jehovah had marched before the Israelites into the promised land. Might not the Christians more reasonably hope that the rivers would open for their passage, that the walls of the strongest cities would fall at the sound of their trumpets, and that the sun would be arrested in his mid-career to allow them time for the destruction of the infidels? Of the chiefs and soldiers who marched to the Holy Sepulchre, I will dare to affirm that all were prompted by the spirit of enthusiasm, the belief of merit, the hope of reward, and the assurance of divine aid. But I am equally persuaded that in many it was not the soul, that in some it was not the leading principle of action. Their vassals and soldiers trusted their fortunes to God and their master. The spoils of a Turkish emir might enrich the meanest follower of the camp, and the flavour of the wines, the beauty of the Grecian women, were temptations more adapted to the nature than to the profession of the champions of the cross. The love of freedom was a powerful incitement to the multitudes who were oppressed by feudal or ecclesiastical tyranny. Under this holy sign, the peasants and burghers who were attached to the servitude of the glebe might escape from a haughty lord and transplant themselves and their families to a land of liberty. The monk might release himself from the discipline of his convent. The debtor might suspend the accumulation of usury and the pursuit of his creditors. And outlaws and malefactors of every caste might continue to brave the laws and elude the punishment of their crimes. These motives were potent and numerous. When we have singly computed their weight on the mind of each individual, we must add the infinite series, the multiplying powers of example and fashion. The first proselytes became the warmest and the most effectual missionaries of the cross. Among their friends and countrymen, they preached the duty, the merit, and the recompense of their holy vow, and the most reluctant hearers were insensibly drawn within the whirlpool of persuasion and authority. The martial youths were fired by the reproach or suspicion of cowardice. The opportunity of visiting with an army the sepulchre of Christ was embraced by the old and infirm, by women and children, who consulted rather their zeal than their strength. And those who in the evening had derided the folly of their companions were the most eager the ensuing day to tread in their footsteps. The ignorance which magnified the hopes diminished the perils of the enterprise. Since the Turkish conquest, the paths of pilgrimage were obliterated. The chiefs themselves had an imperfect notion of the length of the way and the state of their enemies, and such was the stupidity of the people that at the sight of the first city or castle beyond the limits of their knowledge, they were ready to ask whether that was not the Jerusalem, the term and object of their labours. Yet the more prudent of the Crusaders, who were not sure that they should be fed from heaven with a shower of quails or manna, provided themselves with those precious metals which in every country are the representatives of every commodity. To defray, according to their rank, the expenses of the road, princes alienated their provinces, nobles their lands and castles, peasants their cattle and the instruments of husbandry. The value of property was depreciated by the eager competition of multitudes, while the price of arms and horses was raised to an exorbitant height by the wants and impatience of the buyers. Those who remained at home with sense and money were enriched by the epidemical disease. The sovereigns acquired at a cheap rate the domains of their vassals, and the ecclesiastical purchasers completed the payment by the assurance of their prayers. The cross, which was commonly sewed on the garment in cloth or silk, was inscribed by some zealots on their skin, and hot iron or indelible liquor was applied to perpetuate the mark. And a crafty monk who showed the miraculous impression on his breast was repaid with a popular veneration and the richest benefices of Palestine. The 15th of August had been fixed in the Council of Clermont for the departure of the pilgrims, but the day was anticipated by the thoughtless and needy crowd of plebeians, and I shall briefly dispatch the calamities which they inflicted and suffered before I enter on the more serious and successful enterprise of the chiefs. Early in the spring, from the confines of France and Lorraine, above 60,000 of the populace of both sexes flocked round the first missionary of the crusade and pressed him with clamorous importunity to lead them to the Holy Sepulchre. The hermit, assuming the character, without the talents or authority, of a general, impelled or obeyed the forward impulse of his votaries along the banks of the Rhine and Danube. Their wants and numbers soon compelled them to separate, and his lieutenant, Walter the Penniless, a valiant though needy soldier, conducted a vanguard of pilgrims whose condition may be determined from the proportion of 8 horsemen to 15,000 foot. The example and footsteps of Peter were closely pursued by another fanatic, the monk Godescal, whose sermons had swept away 15,000 or 20,000 peasants from the villages of Germany. Their rear was again pressed by a herd of 200,000, the most stupid and savage refuse of the people, who mingled with their devotion a brutal license of rapine, prostitution, and drunkenness. Some counts and gentlemen, at the head of 3,000 horse, attended the motions of the multitude to partake in the spoil. But their genuine leaders, may we credit such folly, were a goose and a goat, who were carried in the front, and to whom these worthy Christians ascribed an infusion of the divine spirit. Of these, and of other bands of enthusiasts, the first and most easy warfare was against the Jews, the murderers of the Son of God. In the trading cities of the Moselle and the Rhine, their colonies were numerous and rich, and they enjoyed, under the protection of the emperor and the bishops, the free exercise of their religion. At Verdun, Trèves, Mentz, Spires, Worms, many thousands of that unhappy people were pillaged and massacred, nor had they felt a more bloody stroke since the persecution of Hadrian. A remnant was saved by the firmness of their bishops, who accepted a feigned and transient conversion. But the more obstinate Jews opposed their fanaticism to the fanaticism of the Christians, barricaded their houses, and precipitating themselves, their families, and their wealth into the rivers or the flames, disappointed the malice, or at least the avarice, of their implacable foes. Between the frontiers of Austria and the seat of the Byzantine monarchy, the Crusaders were compelled to traverse an interval of 600 miles, the wild and desolate countries of Hungary and Bulgaria. Both nations had imbibed the rudiments of Christianity. The Hungarians were ruled by their native princes, the Bulgarians by a lieutenant of the Greek emperor. But on the slightest provocation, their ferocious nature was rekindled, and ample provocation was afforded by the disorders of the first pilgrims. Agriculture must have been unskilful and languid among a people whose cities were built of reeds and timber, which were deserted in the summer season for the tents of hunters and shepherds. A scanty supply of provisions was rudely demanded, forcibly seized, and greedily consumed, and on the first quarrel the Crusaders gave a loose to indignation and revenge. But their ignorance of the country, of war, and of discipline exposed them to every snare. The Greek prefect of Bulgaria commanded a regular force. At the trumpet of the Hungarian king, the 8th or the 10th of his martial subjects bent their bows and mounted on horseback. Their policy was insidious, and their retaliation on these pious robbers was unrelenting and bloody. About a third of the naked fugitives, and the hermit Peter was of the number, escaped to the Thracian mountains, and the emperor, who respected the pilgrimage and succor of the Latins, conducted them by secure and easy journeys to Constantinople, and advised them to await the arrival of their brethren. For a while they remembered their faults and losses, but no sooner were they revived by the hospitable entertainment than their venom was again inflamed. They stung their benefactor, and neither gardens, nor palaces, nor churches were safe from their depredations. For his own safety, Alexius allured them to pass over to the Asiatic side of the Bosphorus. But their blind impetuosity soon urged them to desert the station which he had assigned, and to rush headlong against the Turks, who occupied the road of Jerusalem. The hermit, conscious of his shame, had withdrawn from the camp to Constantinople, and his lieutenant, Walter the Penniless, who was worthy of a better command, attempted without success to introduce some order and prudence among the herd of savages. They separated in quest of prey, and themselves fell an easy prey to the arts of the Sultan. By a rumour that their foremost companions were rioting in the spoils of his capital, Solomon tempted the main body to descend into the plain of Nicaea. They were overwhelmed by the Turkish arrows, and a pyramid of bones informed their companions of the place of their defeat. Of the first Crusaders, 300,000 had already perished before a single city was rescued from the infidels, before their graver and more noble brethren had completed the preparations of their enterprise. None of the great sovereigns of Europe embarked their persons in the First Crusade. The Emperor Henry IV was not disposed to obey the summons of the Pope. Philip I of France was occupied by his pleasures. William Rufus of England by a recent conquest. The kings of Spain were engaged in a domestic war against the Moors, and the northern monarchs of Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, and Poland were yet strangers to the passions and interests of the south.
Beside this rabble of the First Crusade, some more patrician crusaders were led by Godfrey of Bouillon, who travelled through Europe and passed by Constantinople, where the Emperor Alexius was a cautious supporter of these Western strangers. The knights of this crusade amounted to some 100,000 on horseback, with perhaps another 500,000 foot soldiers. Gibbon tells us that if the Latin authors are to be credited, then more than 6 million people migrated from Europe to Asia for this struggle, a figure that he sensibly disdains to accept. By 1099 AD, the Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, to which they laid siege. After 40 days, Godfrey and his fellow princelings stood victorious on the city's battlements, and watched as 70,000 Moslems were put to the sword. Godfrey was acclaimed king of Palestine, though his victory was short-lived. Jerusalem was to change hands many times more. Many more crusades were to follow in the 12th and 13th centuries, and an uneasy relationship developed between the Western princes who trekked to Asia to reclaim Jerusalem and the Byzantine emperors, Christians but of a different creed, at Constantinople. Religious strife between Constantinople, where one god was worshipped, and the Western Latin princedoms, where the Trinity was venerated, eventually resulted in open conflict within Constantinople itself. A fire broke out in the city, and the conflagration lasted 8 days and nights. In 1204 AD, Constantinople was taken by force by Boniface, Marquis of Montferrat, who led the Trinitarian Christian inhabitants of the city at that time, many of whom were but transient pilgrims en route to the Holy Lands.
Pope Innocent III accuses the pilgrims of respecting, in their lust, neither age, nor sex, nor religious profession, and bitterly laments that the deeds of darkness, fornication, adultery, and incest were perpetrated in open day, and that noble matrons and holy nuns were polluted by the grooms and peasants of the Catholic camp. It is indeed probable that the license of victory prompted and covered a multitude of sins, but it is certain that the capital of the East contained a stock of venal and willing beauty sufficient to satiate the desires of 20,000 pilgrims, and female prisoners were no longer subject to the right or abuse of domestic slavery. The Marquis of Montferrat was the patron of discipline and decency. The Count of Flanders was the mirror of chastity. They had forbidden, under pain of death, the rape of married women or virgins or nuns, and the proclamation was sometimes invoked by the vanquished and respected by the victors. Their cruelty and lust were moderated by the authority of the chiefs and feelings of the soldiers. For we are no longer describing an eruption of the northern savages, and however ferocious they might still appear, time, policy, and religion had civilized the manners of the French, and still more of the Italians. But a free scope was allowed to their avarice, which was glutted even in the Holy Week by the pillage of Constantinople. The right of victory, unshackled by any promise or treaty, had confiscated the public and private wealth of the Greeks, and every hand, according to its size and strength, might lawfully execute the sentence and seize the forfeiture. A portable and universal standard of exchange was found in the coined and uncoined metals of gold and silver, which each captor, at home or abroad, might convert into the possessions most suitable to his temper and situation. Of the treasures which trade and luxury had accumulated, the silks, velvets, furs, the gems, spices, and rich movables were the most precious, as they could not be procured for money in the ruder countries of Europe. An order of rapine was instituted, nor was the share of each individual abandoned to industry or chance. Under the tremendous penalties of perjury, excommunication, and death, the Latins were bound to deliver their plunder into the common stock. 3 churches were selected for the deposit and distribution of the spoil. A single share was allotted to a foot soldier, 2 for a sergeant on horseback, 4 to a knight, and larger proportions according to the rank and merit of the barons and princes. For violating this sacred engagement, a knight belonging to the Count of St. Paul was hanged with his shield and coat of arms round his neck. His example might render similar offenders more artful and discreet, but avarice was more powerful than fear, and it is generally believed that the secret far exceeded the acknowledged plunder. Yet the magnitude of the prize surpassed the larger scale of experience or expectation. After the whole had been equally divided between the French and Venetians, 50,000 marks were deducted to satisfy the debts of the former and the demands of the latter. The residue of the French amounted to 400,000 marks of silver, about £800,000 sterling. Nor can I better appreciate the value of that sum in the public and private transactions of the age than by defining it as 7 times the annual revenue of the Kingdom of England.
The collapse of the Greek emperors and the desecration of Constantinople by the French and Venetian pilgrims meant that the empire was now a mere husk. The French and Venetians agreed to divide and administer the city through 12 electors, with a majority choosing the Emperor of the East, and they first selected Baldwin, Count of Flanders and Hainault. The Greek citizens of Constantinople were excluded from all civil and military office.
But peace was banished, and industry was crushed in the disorders of the feudal system. The Roman emperors of Constantinople, if they were endowed with abilities, were armed with power for the protection of their subjects. Their laws were wise, and their administration was simple. The Latin throne was filled by a titular prince, the chief and often the servant of his licentious confederates. The fiefs of the empire, from a kingdom to a castle, were held and ruled by the sword of the barons, and their discord, poverty, and ignorance extended the ramifications of tyranny to the most sequestered villages. The Greeks were oppressed by the double weight of the priest, who was invested with temporal power, and of the soldier, who was inflamed by fanatic hatred, and the insuperable bar of religion and language forever separated the stranger and the native. As long as the Crusaders were united at Constantinople, the memory of their conquest and the terror of their arms imposed silence on the captive land. Their dispersion betrayed the smallness of their numbers and the defects of their discipline, and some failures and mischances revealed the secret that they were not invincible. As the fear of the Greeks abated, their hatred increased. They murmured, they conspired, and before a year of slavery had elapsed, they implored or accepted the succor of a barbarian whose power they had felt and whose gratitude they trusted.